Welcome to Authors on Tour Live, a weekly podcast for people who love to hear about books from the authors themselves. My name is Darren Fote, and today we are podcasting live from the Tattered Cover Bookstore, one of the premier independent bookstores in the nation, with 3 locations in the Metro Denver area. You can visit www.authorsontourlive.com for a complete list of upcoming podcasts. Wait a minute, it's time to begin.
I am honored to introduce our guest speaker this evening. He is an award-winning historian and author. He's a history professor at Rice University. He's also the presidential historian for CNN. Dr. Douglas Brinkley is here with us this evening to present and talk about his latest book, Rightful Heritage, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Land of America. I would say that this book is essential for anyone who cherishes our national parks and forests, wildlife conservation, and Douglas really shows us a different aspect of FDR and his role in creating and improving all of these parks and trails for us here in America that we enjoy today. So to tell us more, and without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Douglas Brinkley.
Good evening, guys. It's wonderful to be here. It's not pandering to say every time I bring a book, I come to Tattered Cover because it's what a great flagship store, and they take the time to report to the New York Times bestseller list, which is always a little bit of extra paperwork, but authors greatly appreciate that they do that here. I wrote and came here a few years back. I did a book called The Wilderness Warrior, Theodore Roosevelt and the Crusade for America. And the genesis of that book was when I was a child. My mother and father were high school teachers, and we grew up in Ohio, and they got their summers off, and we had a Pontiac station wagon and a coachman trailer, and we would go all over America with the big family vacation visiting our country's seminal national park. So by the time I was 18 or went off to college, I had been to Yellowstone and Yosemite and Grand Canyon and Everglades and Rocky Mountain National Park and Carlsbad Caverns, on and on. And it had a gigantic impact on me. Cut to some years back, maybe a decade ago, I started going up to the Badlands of North Dakota, to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, one that my parents never took me to, that we had gone to the Badlands of South Dakota, but not up in North Dakota. And I just fell in love with it up there. If you go there today, you're guaranteed to see antelope and buffalo, prairie dog towns. And this was where Theodore Roosevelt spent his Wild West years. And I realized that was sort of the birthplace of the conservation movement, his ranch there, because, he discovered North Dakota, Theodore Roosevelt. Let me just say a couple things about TR before I get into FDR. Theodore Roosevelt was born in 1858. His mother was from Georgia. His father was from New York. Tells you 1858 what? The Civil War. A child growing up in Manhattan in the middle of the Civil War with a mother that loved Robert E. Lee and a father who loved Lincoln and Grant. And they had horrible fights. And Theodore Roosevelt turned his back on really the South and the North and felt that Nirvana was the American West, that this was going to be the new Garden of Eden. He got extremely excited about the West as a boy. Not just for that one reason, meaning the South screwed up with slavery and the North screwed up with hyper-industrialization, but because the boys' magazines of the 1860s and 1870s were starting to show photographs of Crater Lake in Oregon or Mesa Verde in Colorado. And this was the first time people were starting to understand all these extraordinary treasured landscapes in the West and see photographic evidence of them in a mass-marketed way. And young Theodore Roosevelt, beyond being born in 1858, he was just 1 year old when Charles Darwin published On the Origins of Species. Came out in 1859. That book got lost in the hubbubaloo of the Civil War. But it did not get lost on Theodore Roosevelt's father, who became an ardent Darwinian, a lover of Darwin, and so did Theodore Roosevelt's uncle, Robert Barnwell Roosevelt. His Uncle Rob, called himself a Darwinian scientist. He wrote Darwin-like essays about frogs and eels. He wrote a book called The Waterfowl of Florida. He wrote a book on Lake Superior. And meanwhile, his father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., is the founder of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And so young Theodore Roosevelt was enamored with conservation and the outdoor life, the natural world, so much so that he went to Harvard and majored in what we would call today wildlife biology, and wrote a book as an undergraduate, his first book, called The Summer Birds of the Adirondacks. And the big thing for Theodore Roosevelt was believing that nature had a curative effect on people. Living in New York City, Theodore Roosevelt was ill with asthma. I just picked up at the Denver airport, and it's almost a defunct magazine now, but Newsweek today is talking about the rates of asthma in Detroit from the factories that are there, and how whole communities of children are asthmatic. It's the cover story of Newsweek. It's a follow-up to the Flint crisis. With Theodore Roosevelt's New York City, he was so chronically sick with asthma due to the bad air. But when he got to the Catskills and the Adirondacks, he felt like $1 million. And so he started feeling healthy in these outdoor environments far from what they used to call the devil's laboratory of the cities. And but Theodore Roosevelt we got deeply involved with the natural world, but he went into politics and was a state senator there in Albany when he got a young reformist Republican, when a runner of a Western Union telegram came up, and on the message it said, it was from his brother, and it said, "Theodore, get in and back to New York City. Mother is burning up with fever, and Alice is giving birth." And so double message. He rushed from Albany to New York City. It's still gaslit New York, and goes to the brownstone. Theodore Roosevelt was born in New York, as I mentioned, in 1858. That same building, on one floor, his mother had 104 fever with Bright's disease. Other floor, his wife had burning fever, having a difficult childbirth. He would shuttle from floor to floor, checking up on the two women that meant everything in his life, and they both died that night. It was Valentine's Day, and he lost them both, and a deep and dark depression fell over him. And in his diary, he put an X through it and wrote, "The light is burned out of my life forever." And it's an amazing document to things, meaning he was very depressed. That's when his sister took the baby who survived, Alice Longworth Roosevelt, and he went out. The Northern Pacific Railroad was being built connecting Seattle really to New York City, but they're building it from Atlantic to Pacific, and it meet in the middle for the spike ceremony. He got off in the Western Dakota Territory, Medora, North Dakota, where Theodore Roosevelt National Park is. And that began his years in the wilderness, and where he wrote about grizzly bear, and he wrote about the Little Missouri River. He wrote some beautiful pieces about the ranching life, hunting life, but also served as an ornithologist of the region and wrote about the ecosystem, as we call it today. I mention all this because I said that's where I think the modern conservation movement becomes born, because it was there in Medora that he decides he wants a buffalo head. It was popular to have a buffalo head because they, as a taxidermy-like trophy on your wall. Well, we used to have 60 million buffalo herding across America, thunderous herds. They've all been slaughtered. And it was down to about, 2,000 buffalo only left before extinction. And here Theodore Roosevelt's looking to go kill one because he wants that. He loves the animal so much, he wants one for his wall. And he had to hire the single best hunt guide money could buy. And even with that buffalo guide, it took him over a week to find the buffalo. There were so few left. He eventually shot one, and they did a Native American dance around it, and they cut out the tongue and ate the hump. Those were the delicacies when you would eat it back then. And he shipped the head off to St. Paul to be mounted, and it went to Sagamore Hill, his home in Long Island. Well, that would just be another dead buffalo story, except TR got haunted by it and decided we are going to restore and bring all the mammals back to North America. And he rushes back to New York and creates the American Bison Society, Boone and Crockett Club, all these ideas of bringing back the mammals that had been so depleted, so slaughtered. The buffalo was hated by everybody. The cavalry couldn't stand them because they were the food supply for the Native Americans. So in the Indian Wars, they would slaughter the buffalo willy-nilly, as many as they could, to take away the substance for Native peoples. The railroads hated the buffalo because they'd come to training at night, hits a big herd, and it derails the train, so they wanted them dead. And the telegraph companies hated the buffalo because they love to scratch their backs on those poles, and it's like a ton of weight, and they collapse. So nobody liked them when Theodore Roosevelt's starting this. And it was hugely successful, so much so he went to the Bronx Zoo, Theodore Roosevelt, and personally raised a herd of buffalo, genetically perfect one. That was harder to do than you think. And got a train and brought them back to Oklahoma, Wichita Mountain, near Fort Sill. And all the native Indians thought the buffalo had disappeared down the top of the mountain and would someday come back. And here's Theodore Roosevelt with Comanche Chief Quanah Parker releasing all of those buffalo. And today when you travel the Great Plains and go in Colorado or Nebraska and you see buffalo, they're coming from that Bronx Zoo herd that Theodore Roosevelt rehabilitated. So TR becomes so famous with conservation, and I don't and for compression's sake, let me just say that, but he fights in the Spanish-American War. He has his so-called crowded hour, July 1st, 1898, with the Rough Riders going into Cuba, up San Juan Hill. He comes back and goes into quarantine in Long Island, and this is July of 1898, and he's elected governor that November. Just a couple months. He was the big war hero. Admiral Dewey and Theodore Roosevelt were the great war heroes. And Theodore Roosevelt becomes governor and puts forward the most progressive natural resource management program ever thought of. He becomes this huge conservationist governor. He's trying to regulate factories from pollution, stop reckless timbering, stop the slaughtering of birds, and wanting to issue a hunting license and all this regulation and protection. So much so that the Republican bosses, Mark Hanna, wanted to get rid of TR as governor. Being governor of New York was a big job back then, guys. We didn't have Florida and Texas and California with that kind of population. And so it was everything. Governor of New York was about as big a job. The only thing bigger is president. And the only way they could get rid of TR was to put him on as VP. For William McKinley, he takes the bait. And then, of course, McKinley gets shot in Buffalo, New York. And when they went looking for Theodore Roosevelt, the vice president, nobody could find him. He was lost in the wild. He did another one of his wilderness adventures. He climbed to the top of Mount Marcy in the state of New York, the highest peak. And eventually they had to get to Theodore Roosevelt. A runner gets to him. He comes to Buffalo. And if you go to Buffalo today, there's one home where McKinley dies, and then the home where Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in as president. He refused to put his hand on a Bible. He's the only president that was not sworn in with the Bible. And then from 1901 to 1909, Theodore Roosevelt saves about 234 million acres of wild America on this wild, revolutionary conservationist agenda. How does he do that? How do you just save these places? Well, as most of you probably know, the one mechanism that's been a constant is to become a national park, Congress has to approve it. And so we got a few of those. Mesa Verde here in Colorado was Theodore Roosevelt National Park. I mentioned Crater Lake. That was TR. Wind Cave, South Dakota, TR. But they didn't have a big appetite for these big parks, Congress. And so Roosevelt found two other major mechanisms to circumvent Congress. And the big one, and this all plays into FDR, the big one is the Antiquities Act of 1906. Because John Lacey, a Republican from Iowa who loved the outdoor life and the American landscapes and was very used as a kind of trick almost, and created an elastic bill, this Antiquities Act of 06, because people back then were coming around in the West and stealing dinosaur bones everywhere. And they were looting Native American sites, antiquity sites, kivas or ruins. And European museums were coming here and just looting and stealing, petrified wood and all this for European markets. And so the Antiquities Act basically said the President of the United States has the executive power for science to come in, and it's like a murder site, that yellow plastic, to put a 5-acre archaeological dig site under federal control, to put 16 acres of a native area under federal control with executive order. Theodore Roosevelt goes to the Grand Canyon, stands on the lip of that divine abyss, as it's been called, and said to the effect, "Do not touch it. God has made it. You will only mar it. Leave the Grand Canyon alone." Oh, he was surrounded by his Rough Riders who served with him in Cuba. Congress, a few years later, goes to mine the Grand Canyon for zinc, asbestos, and copper. They don't want it as a national park. Theodore Roosevelt grabs that Antiquities Act and applies it, which was meant for small acreage. He applies it to 600,000 acres of an executive order. And when people scream bloody murder about it, that's not the spirit of the Antiquities Act, what it was meant for. And he said, it said science, show me a better example of erosion at work than the Grand Canyon, and we can study that. And it got sued. The government got sued. It all went to the court, and Theodore Roosevelt won the court case. And this establishes presidents getting to use executive power to create national monuments. He did it with Muir Woods, California, and Devil's Tower, Wyoming, and on, TR. But that precedent is important. A couple weeks ago, I saw President Obama, and he came in, and he was very excited, and he told me he had just used TR's Antiquities Act. I just signed 3 new national monuments in Nevada, 1.7 million acres, without a whole lot of media attention, using that Antiquities Act mechanism. But, when Congress is asleep at the wheel, you usually like doing it on your way out, Bill Clinton did it on his way out with the Escalante in Utah, and it was so unpopular that when he did the creation of the Escalante got saved, Colorado Plateau. Bill Clinton, do you know he gave the announcement of the creation at the Grand Canyon because they were afraid for his security if he went and did it in Utah? It was that controversial. And the other mechanism Theodore Roosevelt had was 100 years ago, all the women here would have come wearing a hat with an ornamental feather. Just like the buffalo were slaughtered, they were slaughtering the heron and egrets. And guys, if there's something that has to be federally done, it's bird protection. Right? I mean, it does no good to have the Connecticut Audubon Society with progressive laws and protecting the birds so the birds fly to Florida and get slaughtered. You've got to have federal laws for bird protection. But in Florida, there was a feather mafia, and they were slaughtering all these birds. They would come in with like semi-automatic weapons, boom, 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 pluck the one beautiful feather from each bird, steal the eggs, and all the rookeries were dying. To a point there, no flamingo were left in Florida, on and on. Theodore Roosevelt looked into the situation, what to do, and he said, what will stop me from declaring this entire Indian River region a federal bird reservation? And the lawyer said, well, and before they can even answer, he said, I so declare it. And Pelican Island, Florida, is our nation's first wildlife refuge. It's called a federal bird reserve back then. Theodore Roosevelt creates 51 federal bird reservations using executive authority, from saving the albatross of Hawaii to an area of the Yukon Delta in Alaska is the size of West Virginia to the Gulf Islands off of Louisiana, on and on. 51. Theodore Roosevelt takes that 51. Franklin Roosevelt will take those 51 and in 1940 create U.S. Fish and Wildlife. That's the birth of it. With Franklin, he not only does he inherit those 51 of TRs, but now we have 550 national wildlife refuges that belong to you guys because of TR and FDR. And so you could see how kinetic TR and conservation was. Now, Franklin Roosevelt's born, he's the fifth cousin of Theodore. His Eleanor Roosevelt was the child of Theodore Roosevelt's brother who committed suicide, jumped out a window with depression. But Eleanor was, TR was her male figure of guidance and advice. And so it's his niece. And Franklin Roosevelt marries Theodore Roosevelt's niece. It's pretty close. Not just that. Everything FDR does is modeled on Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt goes to Groton and Harvard. FDR goes to Groton and Harvard. Theodore Roosevelt runs for the state senate of New York and heads Forest, Fish, Game Committee as his big thing he chairs in Albany. FDR does the same. Theodore Roosevelt becomes Assistant Secretary of the Navy. FDR becomes Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Theodore Roosevelt becomes Governor of New York. FDR becomes Governor of New York. Theodore Roosevelt becomes this huge conservation president. FDR becomes the huge conservation president. And that's one of the first things you've got to understand of the influence of Franklin Roosevelt is TR. Now, add to that, I mentioned he was born in Hyde Park, New York. That's on the Hudson River. And if Theodore Roosevelt loved the Badlands and the West, FDR loves the scenic Hudson. 315 miles from Tier of the Clouds in the Adirondacks down to the bay of where Manhattan is. Spectacular river. It's called the Rhine of America. Gorgeous. And a cavalcade of American history unfolds on the Hudson, whether it's the creation of West Point on the Hudson as a garrison and school, or whether it's George Washington holding up in Newburgh during the Revolution, or the Battle of Saratoga, or, Rip Van Winkle lore, and the whole the Hudson River School of painters of pastoral landscape painting. It is this big natural history protection movement up in the Catskills and Adirondacks, and FDR is raised with that. Furthermore, and wherever his whole life, wherever he'd write, I've seen so many letters. He'd write, "Oh, I miss the Hudson. The Hudson's my life. It's my blood. If I bleed, I'll bleed the Hudson River." Really somebody who had a sanctified landscape. It was his idyllic Hyde Park on the Hudson. He was born there. He lived his whole life in the same house, and he's buried there. But FDR now, the big thing I want you to know about Franklin Roosevelt when he runs for state politics is he's an upstate New York politician. And his occupation is tree grower. Whenever he'd fill out a form for occupation, he'd write tree grower or tree farmer. He wasn't just being cute. That's how he made his money. He ran a giant tree plantation along the Hudson. And it's still up there today. Forestry is a big industry along that part, right near the Catskills, New Paltz, up the Hudson in there. And, I've seen he would take out ads in the New York Times and other papers, but just focus on the Times since it still survived today. There'd be ads that say, buy your Christmas tree from Franklin D. Roosevelt, have a New Deal Christmas, get your trees directly from the president. He would send trees to Churchill, and kings and queens came right from his tree farm. And keep in mind, guys, that was his constituency. Farmers, apple growers, tree farmers. These were who he represented. He would get bitter if somebody had a program put in, he's from New York City. I've seen 2 letters where he wrote where somebody put in a program, "Do never say I'm from New York City. I'm from Hyde Park up the Hudson. And here's where it plays out politically different. Robert Caro, who's doing these wonderful volumes on Lyndon Johnson, wrote a book on Robert Moses called The Power Broker. Moses' view of recreation in the 1910s, 20s, 30s was New York City people leave the city for a half a day and go to Jones Beach, or go just to, right outside a little recreation, come back to the big city. FDR hated that. FDR said you've got to come up the river and spend 3 days upstate New York. Tourism, history, heritage tourism, ecotourism. It was dollars for his district. That was it still is up there. History tourism and outdoor recreation is gigantic business upstate New York. FDR fights to have places, winter wonderlands for ski lifts upstate New York. And his whole life is about getting urban people to come upstate. Now, for compression's sake, during World War I, FDR is Assistant Secretary of the Navy. But do you realize in 1920, he runs for vice president on James Cox's ticket? It's Cox and FDR. And they get beat badly by Warren Harding. So let me just pause you for a minute in that year 1920, because that's when the conservation movement dies for a spell. Theodore Roosevelt died in 1919. He was such a larger-than-life persona on this issue, creating Boy Scouts and camping and parks, and he did it in his presidency and ex-presidency. And, he went to the Amazon and Africa and promoting all this. When he died, nobody could fill that void. And in 20, Harding came in, and Harding was a Republican destined to try to unravel TR conservation. So you have Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover in the 20s, who are the antithesis of Theodore Roosevelt-styled conservation. And they're in charge. So when FDR loses in 20, he goes back to Springwood and Hyde Park on the Hudson. And so I'm going to run my tree farm, try to make a little bit of money as a lawyer, and I'll run the Greater Boy Scouts of New York, because Theodore Roosevelt ran the Greater Boy Scouts of New York. And he gets all these inner city kids from tenements, slums, poor kids, and gets them a kind of a getaway long weekend like he liked, those 3 days away from their urban angst, and got them to go to Bear Mountain State Park. And at Bear Mountain, FDR meets all the boys. He's the grand impresario. They toss horseshoes. They have hot dog roasts. They canoe. And he goes swimming with the Boy Scouts. And he contracts the polio virus that August of 1921. Now, polio from the water. Polio does not manifest itself immediately, like viruses have a few days of before they do. And he had left Bear Mountain and went to Campobello, New Brunswick, the Maine-New Brunswick border, where the family had a summer cottage. And the day before, the last day of his life where he could walk, he had gone out in a boat and was teaching his sons how to do forest fire protection and put out forest. A big cause of FDR by 21 was those steel towers you see, lookouts for how to coordinate forest fire protection and all of this. And he goes back home after that day, Campobello, and he doesn't feel well. He goes to bed early. He's got the sweats. He's restless, has a migraine, and he wakes up in the morning with zero feeling on the lower half of his body. He cannot move. And sheer and utter terror takes over him. They are fearful of what it is. Polio words bandied about, but very carefully. And Eleanor Roosevelt swoops in. She's there, and it's Florence Nightingale. She didn't have to be Florence Nightingale. Their marriage was very strained. Franklin had an affair with Lucy Mercer. She had discovered the love letters. Their marriage wasn't what it used to be. And suddenly, she now had to get him to New York City Hospital from Maine, get him back to Springwood. Guys, when FDR finally goes to Springwood with the reality he can't walk, nobody wanted to be with him because being with a polio meant you can get it. We did not know how it was. People were so from being this hot. I'm 1920. I'm Mr. VP for Cox, and we just won World War I, and everything's grand. To nobody wanting to be near him. Only his advisor, Lewis Howe from Saratoga Springs area, would hang out with him. Howe had so many medical illnesses his own and had a life that was almost subservient to Franklin Roosevelt. And Eleanor left to go do labor union organizing. And he's left there with the chipmunks and the woodchucks and the blue jays and the Hudson River. And he starts trying to build his upper body. He gets some strength. And then he has one friend who hangs with him a lot named Manswell Crosby, who I write about in Rightful Heritage. And Crosby is the top ornithologist upstate New York. The first organization FDR ever joined was the American Ornithological Union. And now he hooks up with this great ornithologist. They go to Florida, and he gets lost in the Everglades and tries to find himself down in that great part of southern Florida. Their mission is to see how many birds, doing a bird count of more species. But he recognizes the sunshine and the water makes him feel better. He soon after, while he's in Florida, he writes a letter to Robert Sterling Yard of the National Parks. We've got to make the Everglades a park. He comes back up to New York and then buys a thermal water resort in Warm Springs, Georgia, that becomes the Little White House, where he creates a resort for people with polio so they can swim, eat, play chess, and he makes that a tree farm in Georgia in the 1920s. And he decides to make a comeback in politics, and he does it by giving the speech for Al Smith at Madison Square Gardens. And he's supposed to introduce Smith and give this speech, and he trains for it for months to have one son on one arm where he puts his weight on his son's arm and then like a cane, and he created this kind of movement. And when he walked that day to the podium, the whole audience was like, oh my gosh, just like, shoo. And he grabbed the podium, and that voice you all know from his inaugural, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. That voice booms out. And after he gave that speech, and this almost seems apocryphal, but it isn't, he got an over 1 hour standing ovation. And the next day, the New York Times Roosevelt steals the show. Roosevelt's back. Suddenly, he was a political player again. And he runs for governor of New York and wins in 1928. He runs for governor again and wins in 1930. You all know the Wall Street crashes in 29. The financial ruin. Herbert Hoover gets the blame. Nothing good's happening, and he's the most high-profile, the Democratic governor from New York. And his big solution to problems was hiring unemployed boys, a little older than the Boy Scouts, to plant trees around New York and to build reservoirs and to save the re-energize and revitalize the landscape of New York. This project he does with Morgenthau, his apple tree farming neighbor from Hopewell Junction, New York, and it works pretty well. So when he runs for president in 32, a big part of the New Deal is that I'm going to put unemployed men to work planting trees all over America. And he wins big. And in his inaugural address in March of 33, the Nothing We Have Fear But Fear Itself, weeks later, his personal pet New Deal projects launched the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. From 1933 to 1942, these unemployed American men hired by the Roosevelt to be in Roosevelt's tree army plant nearly 3 billion trees all across America. They would take kid from Newark and suddenly they'd find themselves in Shenandoah in Virginia, or out in somebody from Gary, Indiana, suddenly working the canyon lands of the Colorado Plateau. And also FDR is saying every state needs a state park system. And it often gets missed, but our National Park Service developed all the state park systems in the United States. And the CCC provides the labor, and they build boathouses, recreation areas, picnic areas, roads, bridle trails, stocked ponds, bird watching platforms, forest fire protection, killing bug infestation, on and on and on and on. I'm here in Denver. I can tell you so many things that the CCC did in your state. It'd blow your mind. I'll just tell you two. They built Red Rocks Amphitheater here in Denver. That's all CCC project Franklin Roosevelt. They built the road through Rocky Mountain National Park. CCC work crews, even in winter, up there that high, operating out of Estes Park and building that. You know, this is a revolution in land management and land planning, and Roosevelt's hands-on with it. He is at heart a planner. Eleanor Roosevelt would say, people think my husband's not an intellectual. They don't realize Franklin has a map mind. He read maps every day, all day. He loved conservation easements and limited interest conservation and where creeks run and watershed areas and migratory bird hotspots and canyons. And he just loved the map of America. And he spent most of his presidency just buzzing all around, driving all over America, seeing places. Not only does he do the CCC, but he'll start using that Antiquities Act of TRs over and over and over and over and over again. He's only president in a few weeks, and he signs an executive order creating cedar breaks in Utah. You know, does like 10 times more land around arches in Utah. Creates Capitol Reef National Monument. Today it's Capitol Reef National Park. Goes to Zion and quadruples the landmass around it, and is providing all the resources to turn Utah into a national park state. A woman named Mervana Hamilton Hoyt her husband died, her son died. She went to the desert, Mojave, and then went out to what's 29 Palms or Palm Springs area today, and the stars at night in the desert. And she decided, I'm going to save Joshua trees. All of the kids today, they do Burning Man out in the desert, but in those days, kids from LA would come out and pour gasoline on a Joshua tree, and it would shoot up in the sky like a bonfire, and you'd purposely look for the biggest Joshuas to burn because it'd shoot up higher, and they were all being destroyed. And she was working as a horticulturist and worked for Women's Garden Club of Pasadena. Got all these photos collected of Joshua trees, and comes up that I want to create a 1,000,000-acre Joshua tree park. She gets a letter into the Secretary of Interior of FDR, Harold Ickes, and only weeks in office, she gets her quick 5-minute meeting with FDR in the White House. And she knew enough that Eleanor used to say Franklin is a sucker for photographs of beautiful places. So she had all of her photos ready as a grassroots environmental activist. And he's like, oh my gosh, she was telling him about the trees because she knew he loved trees, and they're strange shaped, and they were going through it all. And he said, oh my gosh, she goes, okay, we'll do it. And she was like, whoa, well, Mr. President, wait, you want a Joshua tree? We'll do it. I'll sign it. Executive order. We'll create it. She goes, well, it's a little more complicated. Their railroads still have rights on these two sections here, and there's still mining claims in the 1,000,000 acres that I planned. He said, oh, I don't worry, but lawyers can solve that later. I just do it, and then they'll figure it out. She left stunned, writing people in tears. Did he really just do this? And, this is what he would do all the time. And it was very hubristic and very real. Now, that 1,000,000 acres ended up coming in at 700,000 acres as Joshua Tree National Monument, today National Park. But that was after the lawyers looked and saw some areas. But he would just do it and do it and do it. He'd go down to where I live in Austin, Texas, but he went down to the Gulf. He tried to make the entire Gulf, Texas National Beach. And he went down to Aransas, Port Aransas on the Gulf to fish and saw all the migratory bird life there and all, found out more and more about it, and saved an executive order to save the whooping crane as an endangered species, Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. He went out to the Olympics in Washington State, and big people wanted to timber the rainforest there. Roosevelt's being toured around by Lake Crescent Lodge, if any of you know that area, and they're looking up there, and there is a hillside where somebody had clear-cut a hill, the trees. And in front of this whole little delegation, he stopped and said, "Who's responsible for that?" And people are like, well, and he goes, "Whoever did that, I hope they're roasting in hell," because it was such awful forestry. He goes back and fights and creates Olympic National Park to have that big park up in Washington State. Texas, I mentioned. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The days before D-Day, FDR went to Charlottesville to hide. TR used to go to Charlottesville to hide. There's a cabin in Charlottesville called Pine Knot that Theodore Roosevelt would go with the naturalist John Burroughs there and birdwatch. FDR goes before D-Day to birdwatch in Charlottesville with Pa Watson, a military aide, his best friend, really. And he kind of comes in, doesn't want the media to think something big's happening on June 5th or 6th, comes back in. And do you guys realize on June 6th, the famous announcements about D-Day over the radio and all, he didn't cancel his meetings to create Big Bend National Park. It was founded on June 6, 1944. All the photos of him with land deeds and looking at where you'd set up visitor centers and all of this. That's how you get Big Bend. The whole state of Texas, where I live, every state park's Roosevelt. They'd build adobes. They'd build it always to have rustic architecture that fits into the landscape. Red Rocks here is a perfect example of the kind of work the CCC and the WPA as work relief agencies could do. So I write about all this, the fight for the Great Smoky Mountains National Parks of FDR's, the extraordinarily fight to save the Everglades, 1934, he gets it done. The Okefenokee Swamp gets it done. Mammoth Cave, Kentucky gets it done. Isle Royal, Michigan gets it done. During World War II, the worst conservation battle was Roosevelt's executive order to save Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and save the whole valley with an executive order during the war, and the Republicans screamed bloody murder. Major senators said that FDR is Hitler. That's saying that to newspaper reporters, that he's just stealing land like Hitler would do. And they went after Roosevelt, and today I don't hear everybody thinks Jackson Hole was right to be saved. Roosevelt always saw that these would bring money to the regions, that those scenic features had an economic advantage to them too. I can go on and on with all of these things. In the back of my book, you'll see a list of all the places. It's sort of mind-blowing that the New Deal was able to protect and save. During World War II, he constantly saving wildlife refuges during the war. But I'll give you an example of his mind with this. Pearl Harbor, first week December 1941, Roosevelt weighs in on a really a left-wing environmental activist named Rosalie Edge, who was working to save Hawk Sanctuary in Pennsylvania. She did investigations and wrote that the trumpeter swans were being molested in Henry's Lake, Idaho. Henry's Lake is 15 miles west of Yellowstone. And our country had created, Roosevelt, the War Department, created a place that was called the 10th Mountain Division to train our ski troopers and great skiers to go fight Hitler, Third Reich, to go to Europe in the Alps and Ardennes and the rest. To winter, they did artillery training, they did cross-country skiing, downhill skiing. It was a $24 million facility up in Idaho. And Rosalie Edge, this very far left activist, gets a letter into Harold Ickes through a newspaper reporter that says to Franklin Roosevelt, the trumpeter swan spends its winters at Henry's Lake because the lake doesn't melt because it's warm thermal waters, and they stay there. And if these exercises continue, it will lead to the extinction of the trumpeter swan, which was already struggling with, only hundreds left at that point. 1941, Roosevelt looks into it and writes Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Dear Henry, I am now caught up on the war between the U.S. Army and the trumpeters. I've looked in and investigated the situation, and I vote in favor of the trumpeters. The U.S. Army must denest. Stimson went mad over this. This is insanity. And they kicked him out. And you know where they came? Here to Colorado, Camp Hale. That's why it's there. David Brower, later hero of the Sierra Club, was trained at Camp Hale as a ski trooper. But why is he doing that for the trumpeter swan in the crucible of World War II? Because he's sending a very loud message to the War Department and to everybody. We are not in the war going to bust into our public lands and start clear-cutting, chopping, grabbing minerals, saying for the war effort that we don't keep these sanctuaries viable. These are for eternity, these places. These are for our children and our children's children. These are part of what American democracy is, our national parks, our national monuments, our wildlife refuges, and our state parks. And if there's going to be exercises and all, we will be specific on it, but we are not going backwards on animal protection after generations, meaning TR and himself and their followers had saved all of this. They weren't going to ruin their accomplishment. And it just tells you how hands-on he was about these things. I'll end and open up to questions by telling you by 1944, when you're a historian, you know what we do is read other people's mail for a living. And sometimes you go to these presidential libraries or an archive and you're stunned by new documents you find. Up in FDR library, I found a letter Franklin Roosevelt wrote. It was kind of misfiled in a weird place to the Shah of Iran. There's another one to the King of Saudi Arabia, both different, not form letters, very personal with misspellings and all. And but the gist of them both are, let's just say to the Shah of Iran, I've been now to your country and I see you guys have a real soil problem. And you don't have anywhere near enough trees. And I'm willing to put my personal effort and help you guys. I had to deal with the Dust Bowl. I had to do shelter belts and tree replantings and soil erosion projects. And so I'm going to help you guys. If you want my advice, I'll be your free advisor to help you rehabilitate your landscapes. Or two Middle East leaders that during the war on a variation of that. He could not handle seeing land that was abused. It was a personal affront to him. And he, in 1945, or let's just call it the Christmas 44, January 45, he is now creating the United Nations, his great legacy. Do you guys realize that he hooked up with Gifford Pinchot, the old forester of Theodore Roosevelt, who's now in his 80s and had 4 heart attacks? He's writing his memoir, Breaking New Ground, and the two of them go in cahoots, and they're going to make the cornerstone of the United Nations a banner idea called conservation as the basis of permanent peace. Conservation as the basis of permanent peace. Franklin Roosevelt was pushing hard to create what today you would call a global environmental standard, that you had to have factory regulations on a global way, that you had to have water protection quality done globally, that you had to do wildlife protection globally, and that this was going to be a way to bring the United Nations together, that the world has a standard for natural resource management. They're in deep cahoots. And there's some angry letters FDR writes War Department and writes the new Secretary Cordell Hull, who was Secretary of State, resigned, and Hull was willing to accept Roosevelt's kind of cockamamie thing that he thought, but he was a kind of a rubber stamp for FDR. But the new Secretary of State came out of U.S. Steel, and he was like ignoring Roosevelt's messages. One letter FDR writes to Tinius and says, damn it, Edward, I told you I'm dead serious about this. Wake people up at state. This is the cornerstone. Being like TR on conservation. And then he dies. And he dies April 45, Warm Springs, Georgia. And with it dies conservation as a basis for permanent peace. We still don't have global environmental standards like that. And he gets buried there at Hyde Park, but Harold Ickes knew that wasn't a proper, although the whole bit of the Hudson River Valley was proper. He wanted to do something more. And so when the United Nations, the founding of the UN is at the San Francisco Conference, May of 45, when all of the world's delegates, foreign ministers, they all get to San Francisco to create the UN, they all shuttle up to Marin County to go to Muir Woods National Monument, where the giant redwood trees groves are, which Theodore Roosevelt created as a national monument using that Antiquities Act. And they went deep into the monument and to a beautiful cathedral grove and held their farewell ceremony for Franklin Roosevelt among the giant redwoods as a symbol of his lifelong commitment to conservation and his great love of the great trees of the world, which he thought were the symbol, the givers of life. That Roosevelt always felt that if you wanted to see poverty, all you have to do is see deforestation. If you want to go fly over Haiti and you see Dominican Republic today, you see it's forested, and you almost see a line where Haiti's totally deforested on Hispaniola on the same island. And that tree and proper forestry conservation was what the wealthy, if you were going to be a successful post-World War country like Canada, like the United States, like Denmark, like Sweden, like Norway, like New Zealand, like Australia, you would have to have true conservation laws, regulations, and protections. And much of what we have in our country today, what makes us not just a bunch of strip malls and superhighways and glass towers, are the public lands that both Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt did so much to protect. We owe them both a great deal of gratitude that we had two visionaries in the White House in the 20th century to achieve that. Thank you.
That's all for tonight's Author on Tour. I'm Darren Foden. We have been podcasting live from the Tattered Cover Bookstore in Denver, Colorado. Stay pod tuned in the coming weeks as we podcast Authors on Tour.